I don't know. I think the big turning point, I think that there were a couple of them. I think a big turning point in the campaign was obviously the first debate between Trump and Biden. And I think that was really when people got a good look at what many of us had been saying for a while, that Biden is not fit for office. And I think that's what opened everyone to the possibility that maybe there had been quite a bit more propaganda going on than they wanted to believe, perhaps. So, like, go back to, like, what was that like for you, and then we'll just run it forward to today. And I also want to make sure to touch on how this, and we'll hopefully spend quite a bit of time on this, how this affects your particular missions with ABWE and your podcast as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. So,
Yeah.
I was watching that unfold like everyone else, probably like you. There, we were under no impressions that Joe Biden was fully cognitively with it. Those who
Mhm.
followed, especially conservative leaning media for several years, were aware of that. But that was the moment that everybody in the nation really saw that, regardless of what news source that you were watching. I think what that did for so many people was really just disturb this nice American picture that we have of stability. We just assume that all of our institutions are fundamentally stable. I mean, there's a lot of unstabilizing elements and factors that have happened over the last couple of years. But that was one thing in particular where that became a question for everyone, even looking at the most powerful political office in the world and saying, "Yeah, there's radical instability even at that level. What's happening? Whose hands are really at the control?" And I think as Christians, that's critical to keep in mind. I think we become ineffective in our mission, in our walk with the Lord, when we assume that everything around us, the status quo, is really, it's just going to be the way it is all the time. All things continue as they were, as Peter writes. And that's not the case, right? To be effective, to be active as men in our life and on mission, have to recognize that there's other factors and forces at play in the world, and we have a job to do. We can't just comfortably assume it's business as usual. You know, nations rise and fall, men rise and fall. We certainly saw the fall of one man in that situation,
Mm.
and I think for a lot of people, it was just an awakening moment of realizing they can't assume that things will always continue a certain direction.
So I want to go off-roading immediately and divert a little bit and pick up on something that you said. We can't always assume that things will continue going in the direction that they have, and that's something that I think is really a trap of thought that it's really easy to fall into. That thinking that whatever is represented in this moment, if you just run it out linearly, then that's just how things are going to be forever. That's just going to be a long, slow decline, right? A sharp upwards improvement, or whatever it is, to extrapolate out from this current moment that the future will look like this, only more so. And that's the thing, that it's so easy to start thinking that way and to panic or to get too excited. But as Christians, I think our call is to be wise as serpents, perhaps, to the flows of history, empires rising and fall, men rising and falling, and not get too caught up in trying to imagine that we can predict the future based on current events.
I think you put it well. It's the whole Francis Fukuyama end
Yep.
of history
Yep.
paradigm.
Yep.
It's the whole idea, on the internet. It's nothing ever happens, and suddenly a lot of things happened, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's a significant percentage of not only Americans but American evangelicals, Christians in our churches, that have assumed that paradigm. We live lives, most of us, even if our bank accounts have suffered over the past couple of years, perhaps we do live lives of relative stability, and it's easy to assume that. And by the way, I work with missionaries. I work with churches that are sending missionaries and church planters to the U.S. as well. And one of the things that I've seen is I think over the past several generations of missionary sending efforts, even something as tip of the spear as Christian missionary sending, I think has really been coasting in some ways off of the fumes of this modern American consensus of how the world is. There's certain assumptions that we make about globalism, about political stability across the world, about freedom and democracy and freedom of conscience. And missionaries often do assume those things. Those are the things that allow us to get on an airplane, go somewhere, right, and tell them about Jesus, because of this relative stability that's existed. But there's so many assumptions under the surface with that we do have to look at and examine. And I think as you see that consensus start to break down in a lot of people's thinking, I think what we need to do is have a new missiology that's tailor fit for the current moment that we're in. So this is not necessarily the world of America is automatically the glorious city on a hill, preeminent in all things. And from the United States, we're going to send missionaries to the ends of the earth. Of course, we want to send missionaries, but I think instead, and just using missions as an example, I think there's all parts of the church that this touches. But I think what we have to realize instead is that actually we live in a world that is all contested, and there's contested factions and groups and nations with differing identities, and nations are going to do things differently. We can't assume the stability in the global order, and yet we still have to do the very hard thing of going to our neighbors and going abroad. And so I think we need to make sure that these assumptions of multiculturalism, these assumptions of diversity, those things that are a part of that modern American consensus, that's not really what's driving things like missions, when actually what's driving things like missions is a zeal for the Lord, a zeal to see the lost brought to Christ. And obviously, we need that same zeal in our own nation too, Will.